Welcome to the In-Betwixt and In-Between. This is Leadership Limbo, a podcast aimed at helping middle managers and their supervisors embrace the discomfort and power of leading themselves and others in the midst of it all. We blend real insight with practical tools to help you lead with self-awareness, purpose, and influence, wherever you are on your leadership journey. I'm Josh Hugo, one of your co-hosts, joined by my good friend and other co-host, John Clark. John, happy Thursday morning to you, sir.
Hey, good sir. How are you?
Good. Yeah, it's
Do you think, question for you,
Yeah.
because when we record this, we aren't doing it with the music, but we put that in. Do you think people, how do you think they're feeling about last week's music and the change up? And is that throwing anyone off? Like, were you kind of playing the new song in your head as you were doing it? How did that impact your cadence and your delivery of our opener there? Anyway,
That's a great question. I think I was grooving to that music last week a little bit. So for anyone who heard it and they immediately turned off the podcast out of like, whoa, this isn't Leadership Limbo, and it's normally pensive, lighthearted intro, and now we got this funky stuff going on. Yeah, let us know your thoughts. Feel free to send us a message if you like the music.
yeah.
We're just testing it out a little bit. We've hit how many episodes? 40, 41 now. So we're
Let's see. We're at 13. No, we're at 32. This is our I think this is our 32nd episode total. So not including replays.
I see. Okay.
We had 19 in the first season. And I think this is episode 13 of the second season. So
Okay. Yeah, you keep the John's our data guy. Yeah, but no, doing well today. Got a busy day ahead, but excited to come back to what we talked about last week. But before I pass it to you, for our listeners, again, download, share the podcast. It's been fun for us to talk with more and more people who we've been able to introduce this to, who come back and say that's some good stuff that's happening here. So thank you for all of the new listeners, for our regular subscribers. But anyone who's listening, we would love for you to subscribe. And bonus points if you are willing to take a moment or two to leave us a review wherever you're listening to this podcast. And we also always encourage you to reach out to us. You can find us both on LinkedIn. You can find us on our websites, which are linked in the podcast notes with emails. And for some of our listeners, we know that you know us personally. So, of course, you're always more than willing or welcome to send us a text, and we're more than willing to engage with you. So thank you for all who do that. For all of those who are listening for the first time, welcome. And John, I want to pass it back to you because last week we introduced some pretty I think cerebral, inquisitive, curious stuff about all that's happening in our world. And we want to come back to that today and keep that conversation going.
Yeah. So last week we talked about, how do you lead in times of external challenges? And I think there are two layers to that, and there's more than two layers, but two primary ones. You're thinking about the challenges of the world at large, of a nation or society, and that you're dealing with. And then I think there's also the personal challenges and external things that people face, whether that's you yourself as a leader or the people there's people you lead there specifically. So the knowledge that sometimes it's not impacting everyone, but there's key people that are impacted by that. And so the question was, how do you lead amidst that, and how do you process that, and how do you think about that? And so we really framed it, I think, kind of live processing it to a certain degree. Certainly we've had a concept of a plan, as our president said, but or what is it? A concept of is that what it is?
Yeah, concepts of a plan.
We had concepts of a plan for the episode, but I think, also kind of ad-libbed a little bit on the questions. And so to summarize a little bit of last time, we want to frame some of the questions that we came up with that we believe are important for leaders to ask themselves when you're processing these moments, right? And perhaps it's just a good self-reflection episode or exercise on a regular basis. So the 5 questions are these. Number 1, what do I need right now? Number 2, am I and can I be empathetic? Can I be sympathetic, or how can I be sympathetic? And then when is this turning into pity? So it's like 3 in 1 right there. 3 is, how do we engage with politics, or even like folks' personal politics or beliefs in this space of our business or our team? So what role can that sort of thing actually play in it? What do I name and hold space for versus decide to move forward on? Right. So the idea of, do we actually allow us to sit with this and really talk about it and take some time to dive into it and to strategize around it? Or is it more of a, hey, I've decided it's actually more important for us to kind of keep moving forward with our day-to-day work so we can do the important work we're doing. And then 5 is a final question of what can I actually do? Which might inform the last one of determining what should I hold space for? Can I help make this better for folks? Or if I really feel like I can't, then it's time to move us forward, right? Um, so those are our 5 questions. And I would argue, and we're going to kind of talk about this in our strategies here in a minute, that there's value in doing it in some sort of relative order there, from starting with self to
Mhm,
others to strategy or plan,
mm,
right?
mhm.
Um, and maybe Josh, you would frame it a bit different, but as we were kind of unpacking that, that's how I've read that. And I think the conversation itself helped me to reframe the importance of that order. So,
Yeah,
um, with that, I think Josh, we can get into the strategies, but I want to give you a chance to,
yeah.
share any musings from the last time, or reflections on that last conversation, as we go into today.
No, thanks, John.
You're welcome.
Yeah. We worked yeah, that's a flashback. My very first podcast, and John was on one of those, which was, the campfire conversation, which is still you can find that
Okay.
on
Yep.
early on listening to myself, Jamel and I, the co-host of that show, realized we were often just talking past each other,
Okay.
and so we started to kind of make sure we would say, "Thank you," or acknowledge, which is actually for those who've ever been podcast curious, there's a lot of value to listening to yourself, and I know a lot of us don't like to do it,
I mean, I
but
like.
man, when you listen to yourself, you can identify some interesting patterns of speech, some verbal tics, some anxious
Yeah.
response tendencies. So anyways, a little
I've realized recently that I'm on our podcast specifically rounding the end of my statements with right.
Oh, you came to that recognition on your own. Okay.
I know.
It's interesting. It's
You
really
aren't direct.
interesting to listen to it,
You aren't
isn't it?
direct enough with me. You don't provide feedback. You're afraid of me, I
We
think.
don't yeah, I'm operating under my pseudo self, which we'll get to in a minute. Um, it's a really interesting thing though to listen to yourself, and I think, yeah, John and I actually probably could increase the level of podcast feedback, which is a good quality to have with your leaders, and the people around you, but
But I can say the thing I'm most gonna take away from this conversation today is this idea of being podcast curious. So
there's a lot of podcast curious folks out there. I think it's funny you talk to a lot of people are like, "I've thought about doing it, but I'm not so sure yet."
all
Kinda like, yeah, could
right, let's get this train back on the rails. Let's go.
well, to the point you made about these 5 questions, and I loved what you said last week when you basically said, "Don't just come and figure this out live."
Yeah.
And I think that there's just no going around the fact that the world intersects with work. And I think the best leaders who I've worked with, the best moments of leadership that I think I've been part of, were often the harder moments of acknowledging that there is something going on, whether you were verbally acknowledging it with your team, whether it was individually with yourself, or whether it was some balance of like finding the people on your team who might be affected. The fact is, I think you have to do something with this, and just showing up and rolling with it in a kind of a live manner
Yeah.
is unlikely to serve you and your team well.
Yeah. And I think another thing I would consider is, man, if you feel like, to a certain degree, several times a week or even every couple weeks, I'm feeling like I have to sit with this and walk through these questions because there's a particular thing. I mean, I think I can get that tension because it feels like there's a lot going on in the world, like on a constant basis, and we have we have information of things occurring across the world that 100 years ago we wouldn't have known about. But it also might be mean that you're taking on too much and you're making everything into something you have to solve for others. So,
Mm,
I think this idea of never do it live, and also if you're feeling like every day you're having to really make a plan for this sort of thing, that's the maybe reflection. I need to step back and really understand, like, what do I have control of, and
yeah.
what are the most important times. So I think both of those things are true too. So
Yeah. It's a good lead in
yeah,
actually to what we're going to talk about. So
right.
we wanted to come to the table today, for our listeners with some strategies that might be food for thought, that could plant some seeds of curiosity that help you to think about this. I think I would say big picture, the goal of any work that we're doing here, any of our advice, any of our strategies really is to help you to think, right? At the end of the day, you're going to have to make the decisions as a listener. I'm going to have to make the decisions as a listener, and engagement, someone who engages obviously in producing this, to do something with what we talk about. But one, we want you to think. And I think that that ties nicely to this first strategy of leading from self.
Yeah.
And gosh, that's such it can be contrived. It could be kind of just shared in some sort of passing way. Oh, let me speak for myself, or know yourself to lead yourself. I want to actually encourage everyone. My recognition of this came recently, of like, myself, speak for myself, yourself, and separate the my and the your, and literally just look at that word self, and don't breeze over it, because I think there's so much work in the world of leadership that talks about self. But I think that the fact it's elided with a pronoun in front of it, it's kind of rolls off the tongue. I think if you don't pause and first start by asking, like, what is self? And this isn't meant to be a philosophical podcast. There are plenty of people who know way more about the work of self
We
from a,
just use the word limbo in it, so you're right. No, no, no. Outside of the fact that we use the word limbo as part of our title, but yeah, go on.
yeah, yeah, no, but it's definitely a, a complex topic, concept, idea, philosophically, theologically,
Can I ask you a question about
psychologically.
this? I mean,
Yeah.
so and I thought this was really good, but like my immediate inclination of starting with the idea of questions that are about what do I need now? And so the strategy of lead from self, which I know you're getting into, but I'm, I think some people listening to this, whether they're not managers or leaders, um, or even some leaders might think, well, that's just further proof of like individual self-interest and just caring about yourself, or it's kind of hokey, weak. I'm saying these are terms others might say, not me, but like
Oh yeah.
hokey, weak versions of self-care that aren't really about action and it's self-absorbed. Um, what's why is this not that, I guess, and how do you think about this idea of strategies that start with taking inventory of yourself, and why that's actually important to make you better to lead for others outside of just like, well, if you don't put your oxygen and mask on first, then you can't help others, which
Yeah.
I get, but
Yeah.
yeah, I'd
Gosh.
love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, this, I mean, probably ought to become a longer series on the podcast as we continue to do this work. John and I talk about this fairly often now. I think the simple way is, like, that version of self is not the version of self I'm talking about. That
Yeah.
is kind of the superficial, I don't mean that to diminish the fact that, yeah, self-care matters, but like it's been almost usurped by a sort of commoditized industry of, like, really what that means is massages, relaxation, tuning out. That's not what we're getting at. And I think the idea of self is, like, the reason that this could be the power that unlocks you as a leader is that's all you freaking have is yourself. Otherwise, you're talking for other people, you're absorbing other people's problems, you're trying to take control and responsibility from
Yeah.
others. You're not functioning as yourself. And if you are a leader, if you cannot function as yourself, then who are you? Right? Who are you? And when we're talking about the work of self, is I like to kind of picture this idea of, and visually, if you just picture these concentric circles, the self is at the core of it. That's also where it intersects beautifully with what we're going to talk a little bit about today with spirituality, whether you're coming into this with a spiritual angle, a religious angle, a sense of soul, but yourself is your essence, right? It is really the core of who you are. And outside of that centric, the very center of that circle is this next layer, which is like this pseudo self. These are the postures that you take on in response to pressure, anxiety, the things that you've learned to do in your life, growing up in the core emotional system of your upbringing, which is your nuclear family system. You've learned to take on, I've learned to take on postures that are built in response to anxiety and pressure, which is, of course, when it comes to what's happening in the world, a high pressure environment, right? As a leader, that's only an additional stimuli to create more pressure and anxiety in your life as a leader.
Yeah.
And so we often just find ourselves not operating at the core, but we operate on this level around it, which is sometimes accommodation accommodation for others, figuring out what others need, maybe without even curiosity and taking responsibility. So that rescuer stuff we've talked about on this podcast, or you distance yourself, you're an avoider, you take over and take control and engage in conflict to kind of ram your way through a problem. All of those are not the essence of yourself. And before, I just want to name this concept that I think is really helpful that comes out of the internal family systems theory, which IFS, some of you've maybe read the book who are listening to this, called No Bad Parts. But the author talks about these eight C's of self: calmness, curiosity, clarity, compassion, confidence, courage, creativity, and connectedness. He posits that those are the eight core elements of self. And
Mhm.
anytime we're not operating out of one of those or multiple of those, there's a good chance that we're not being true to who we are at ourself. And I think when we try to tie this back to navigating complex moments in leadership, the anxiety pulls us away from those eight C's. It pulls us into these reactive postures. And when you're doing that, you're not actually effectively leading through the problem. And I want to pass it back to you before I kind
Well,
of
I
keep
want to
going on this. So, yeah,
leading through
what
the
do you think?
problem. I like that, and I was just listening because I liked a lot of that. But once you said leading through the problem, I was like, that is the big difference of what we're talking about of of this idea of leading from self versus just the idea of self care. Again,
Hmm.
I'm not gonna diminish that, but I think
Yeah, what do you mean?
like when you said self care, I think at least the way it's interpreted by others, which I don't think is accurate, but this is what happens with things like psychological safety has been taken over for what it really meant to be something completely different as an example. But self care is often about like, how do you push aside challenge or problems or put those things to the side so you can do things to, basically like do what you want. And that's fine. I get that. Sometimes you need to like put things to the side so you can take care of what you need. I would argue in this of leading from self is how do I actually bring on the challenge and understand it and understand how it's impacting me and embrace it and kind of embrace the suck if you're going to get a little bit more crass with it and say, all right, we're sitting in the shit. How is this impacting me right now? And how do I believe I need to lead myself through this? Right. And when you know that, then like you can even begin to think, well, how can I put those expectations on others or help provide the right language or the right support so that they can also lead themselves through it? Not me lead them through it or me do it for them, but provide them with the guidance and the way that we're going to approach it and understand what our boundaries are in this. So yeah, I really do think it's an interesting one. And I really do encourage people who maybe sit in the space of self-care and I'm sure there's a lot of people on our podcast that really absorb that, but I think there's a lot of leaders who are like, oh, I don't have time for self-care in the way that these folks talk about it. This is, I think, a different form of that that's really important. Like if you do not acknowledge where you're sitting in the discomfort of a thing, then basically all you're going to be doing is accommodating people for what you think they need or what they're expecting from you, rather than like, well, this is what I know is right for me to get through this.
Right.
And at some level,
Right.
we're going to have to, that's going to help people out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No, I like what you're saying, John. A couple of thoughts come to mind. One, I think you got at this, and I would articulate it a little differently. Like the role of leadership is to create the conditions for others to come to
yeah.
that understanding on their own, right? To create the conditions for them to take responsibility for themselves. And as
And
opposed
to
to,
that, and to
yeah, go
that
ahead.
point, like this idea that we sit and I have to craft the perfect way to say this so everyone feels good about what I'm saying.
No, they
That's
can't.
not
You
the
can't
case.
do that.
Sometimes, no, yeah, yeah, you're angry. I can
You
tell.
can't.
Yeah,
You can't do it.
exactly. No, and I think that's where we spend most of our time is like, how am I gonna like toe the line of the ways to say this to make this person over here who's really anxious about feel good, and this person over here who just wants to get back to business to like not be annoyed by it, and I've got to play. You just can't accommodate for everyone, but what you can do is acknowledge and then move forward and give people the time and way to like help lead themselves through it.
That's right. It is their responsibility. I mean, one, you want to be mindful of who's on your team. You want to find a way to transmit communications that can be received well.
Yeah.
And you have to trust that other people have the responsibility to respond appropriately to things they disagree with. And the only way to do that is to model it yourself. And the more that you try to take the responsibility from others, to preempt, to plant a seed to manipulate the conversation to get the outcome that you want for your own sake, to kind of make it smooth, easy, peaceful, whatever. I'm not just saying that from a place of judgment. I'm saying that from an extensive place of experience. The less that you're actually trusting others around you to be able to navigate these complex things. And I think that when we're talking about leading from self, let's make it tangible. One of the common things that leaders often do, you're in front of a room, you say, "Hey, team, what we need to do is this." Watch the we. What I need the team to do is this. What I believe the right step to do here is this. When we start saying we, for example, in leadership, it's this implicit perspective that you're speaking for what others actually want to do. Now, you may need to get people to do that, create the conditions to do it, but the I versus we is a really fascinating concept when it comes to, let's just use an example. This Iran war going on, you're in front of your team. "Hey, team, I know that we're really struggling with what's happening here." You probably have someone in the room who's not struggling whatsoever. So why are you saying we? You say, "I'm really struggling with what is happening. And I know in talking with many of you that many of you are also struggling." That is an intellectually honest statement to make. But when we catch ourselves saying we're now speaking on behalf of others. We're speaking for others. And perhaps the incentive, the motivation behind that statement is actually to, one, maybe be empathetic, but also potentially to diminish the fact that there might be people who disagree, but when you throw in this royal we,
Yeah.
it might actually be disincentivizing somebody with disagreement to speak for
Yeah.
themselves.
Or you're over compensating for the loudest voices or the people that you're thinking about that are the angriest or
Right.
most dominant. Um, and then they kind of as we went back to the idea of people sabotage leaders, and that's what makes it hard to be a self-differentiated leader. Yeah, I think that's important, is to ask yourself, am I saying this because of people I'm worried about in the room, specific people, maybe even afraid of, if I don't say it a certain way, that they'll react a certain way?
Mhm.
Because then you're just, bowing to them versus what's right for me and what you and us together need to do to a certain
Right.
degree, right?
Yeah, and this gets at what, John, you just said, that phrase, and we've talked about it on and off throughout the podcast. But really, if you're listening to this, just say, "Guys, it's great. Lead from self. What is a tool? What is a strategy?" One of those would be establishing clear principles that you
Yeah.
can abide by, right? There's a lot more than just principles alone, but it is an example. Make a commitment. So, like, I'm committed to speaking truth as I see it when complex issues come across uh, the world. Or I am committed to always standing behind I statements, even when I acknowledge that many people in the room feel about it a certain way. And whatever that principle might be, it really needs to be grounded in your intentionality to speak from a position of self. At the end of the day, as a leader, yes, you have a responsibility to create conditions for a lot of people to be successful, but you still are only yourself. And everyone in that room, whether you're a manager, a supervisor, an executive, is looking at you. They're looking at you, right? They want to see somebody who isn't lying to themselves and therefore lying to the group of people around them. And when things are difficult, the more that you try to accommodate for the complexity, the emotions of a difficult moment, and try to, like, paint a picture of empathy and insight for what others might be feeling, the less effectively you're standing in yourself. And frankly, the more likely you're going to start to kind of see some trust chip away from those in the room, because they don't necessarily believe that you're standing behind what you believe. And that's ultimately what people need to see from their leaders, whether they agree with it or disagree with it. You have to trust that they have responsibility to respond to that in an appropriate way. And the way to create that breakthrough is for you to start that in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I think that takes us into this idea of, we'll call it your spiritual health, right? This
Yeah.
can really be tied, I think, to your cognitive curiosity of the world too, if like you're not wanting to think about it as spirituality. Um, but I think we decided this is an important one to talk through, because good leaders can also put themselves outside of the current situation, because there's something more important at any given moment than just their current reality. I think when people are so absorbed in just like the now and the here, and they lose perspective on everything else that matters, that can make it hard to say, hey, in the big picture, what's most important is that our team execute this work really well, right? Or what's really important is that we keep mindful the great things that we are doing here and why that's important. I think sometimes that ties to purpose. It ties to the things that feel that they're bigger than us and more important than us. And so I I think it's, I think we can kind of start there. In some ways to make sure that you are existing on that plane, that you are thinking beyond just like every kind of current moment, the here and the now, and the reactivity of that versus the acceptance that challenge happens, but there is something beyond this, right? Josh, maybe you want to frame it differently, and then
Yeah,
get
gosh.
into some of these things that fit in with this.
I'm kinda chuckling at we're throwing out concepts of self and spirituality in a 35-minute podcast, so obviously, like, these are some things
Yeah,
that we're
but
kinda
that's good.
planting the roots for because for both John and I know from our individual conversations that these are both really important parts of our identities in our lives, and
But I
so
also think, yeah, it's a 35 to 40-minute episode, but the episodes that that people spend 3 hours, that's because they think they're able to tell you, and often you listen for 3 hours and they still didn't because why? Because it's more about the questions you have to grapple yourself
yeah,
and
I
actually
love
spend
that.
time. So you're
Yeah.
just listening to 2 folks that try to spend time in this space as leaders so they can be better, but at the end, you might be like, "I don't know exactly how they answered that. It's probably because we didn't." So I think
Yeah.
it's okay. But
No,
yeah,
I think it's totally great, and I think really that's the way to present this as as something for our listeners to think about is both in terms of your health in leadership, even when we're not talking about integration with bigger challenges in the world, but even when it does come to that side of the table with what's going on outside of just the work world that you're in, I think having a connection to purpose, it goes back to the peace index we talked about,
yeah.
months ago, which is like, what is your sense of purpose? And not just like, do I have a clear job description, but like, what am I doing here? Like, not even what am I doing here in my job, but what am I doing here in life? What is the reason I'm in this world? And we know our listeners can range from people who might be more of in the traditionally religious side of the table to people who might not even have a relationship with the spiritual side of themselves. And I think that's okay. But I do believe, so to speak for myself, I do believe these are the kinds of questions that when it comes to showing up in complex moments of existential concern, I think that it's really important to be having internal conversations with yourself, engaging with a spiritual director, talking to people within a community of people who might look at the world in similar ways or be willing to engage, whether it's through a religious community or something outside of that space. You, I have found that it's been really empowering for me to be able to engage there because it helps me to show up better
Mhm.
when it comes to these moments because some things in life just don't make a lot of sense. Some challenges in life just are hard to explain. And being able to reconcile the difficult moments with a sense of not, I have the explanation as to why this happens, but I have a perspective on myself amidst this vast planet, amidst this incredibly vast universe um, that helps me to just understand what I'm doing here. That has been a tool that has really opened up some access to being a stronger, being a better, being more effective leader for me.
Yeah, and I think, like, and maybe some of this is a little bit of, like, just the ongoing work you have to do so you're ready for those moments, but we think sometimes when we talk about this as, like, the cognitive world you live in, the mental, the neuro part of your life or the spiritual part of your life, because I think people can think of it from one of those 2 directions, right, is purpose, to your point. I mean, coming back to that time, it allows you to sit in those moments of, like, what is number 1, when you talk about leading from self, like, what is my purpose? And how does that and the principles that you talked about, and how does that impact the way I need to lead right now, and I need to show up and help the team move itself forward. The other is, what is the purpose of our work, right? And so when you get back to the purpose, you're like, well, then this outside challenge is something that we can acknowledge, but our work is important and people want to move forward because they're grounded in purpose, right? So I think that's key. I think so. Purpose is one side of spirituality, and how are you sitting in purpose and understanding that, which makes these other moments that feel out of your control like a little bit more. You can navigate them a bit better because you sit in the idea of like, but I know what my purpose is today, and I'm going to keep moving forward. That idea of taking action as a leader. I think the second one that comes from this is like we talk a lot about these moments when the world seems on fire or chaotic or disruptive or bad. And the harder thing I think sometimes as a leader is spending time reminding ourselves of the good or where there is awe or wonder for us to appreciate. And the reason for that is number one, an acknowledgement of there is good in the smallest ways and the biggest ways. There's things that can inspire a sense of awe. And then in those moments when there's real challenge and the world seems pretty disgusting and it's bogged down in shit and muck and grossness, you remind yourself of it. But there's good that I'm working towards here. And I recognize that our old boss, Bill Kurtz, put out one about leaders now in a moment where everything can seem really bad, need to take time to inspire awe in themselves and others. Right. And again,
Yeah.
I see how that connects back to purpose. But when you're grounded in that, these tough moments come up and you don't lose faith. You remind yourself that that's the yin and yang of like existence, right? But I spend time acknowledging and seeing the good. Um, that allows me to kind of work through tough moments.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I have found when you can be across the table from another leader, whether it's you as the leader and a colleague, or both people, maybe your supervisor, who who has a sense of calm, going back to that 8 C's of self, right? One of those is calmness, right? That's it's hard to be calm when things are on fire, but when you can sit across from somebody who can both see the challenge around you for what it is without distancing themselves and just be that presence, right? This goes back to the idea of presence. I think spiritual health has a very clear through line to your ability to be present. Because if everything in the world, if you are reacting to everything in the world always, and you're just consistently in a reactive position, the people that you lead are going to consistently be in a reactive posture as well. And so there's a lot of things in the world that don't make sense. There's a lot of injustice. There's a lot of things that just don't represent that true self piece, right? There's not a lot of compassion at times. There's not a lot of creativity and connection, but it still is the responsibility of a leader for others, a leader who is effective to be able to sit in that presence, that calm presence, to truly unlock the ability of people around them to start taking responsibility for how they need to look at things. And if we really believe in the capacity of humans, and leadership is about getting others to creating the conditions for others to see the capacity they have inside themselves, I think that the spiritual connection is an essential part of your practice. Whatever that might need to look like for you, I would simply encourage you to crack open that book, or maybe you're thriving in this space already. But I do think that it would be hard for me to see a future of effective leaders who don't have some connection to this side of their identity and this side of yourself.
Yeah, and I think what that means is not just in the moments when the chaos occurs and you're like asking yourself, okay, the questions that we asked about earlier and you're running through those, but you need to be proactive in building space and opportunity for your mind to wonder and be absorbed in beauty and awe, and whether that's in a relationship with a person or a
Mhm.
beautiful work of literature you're reading or pieces of art or uh,
Nature.
nature,
Yeah.
like, and and then even finding those moments in the day-to-day part of work, not just when you are lucky enough to get on a hike or something like that, right? So, spending some time trying to, and like, look, you can't, it's hard to manufacture awe, but it comes more often when we provide space and opportunity for it, right? And if you aren't creating space and opportunity, then it's likely you're not going to be grounded in awe and wonder and a feeling of good.
Yeah. Well,
And
just can I just
yeah,
a quick
yeah,
moment of response to that? Um, we're sitting on this digital device that's, you know, a pound and a half of plastic that allows two of us across the city of Denver to communicate, that can then push a button that goes to anywhere in the world. And how many hands, how many miners, how many truck drivers, how many engineers, how many salespeople have been responsible for the very devices that we're both on and for the people driving in their cars? If you can find little moments of just deep awe and appreciation in what it is that's in front of you, that's a spirit, in my opinion, in my experience, that's a spiritual connection to the universe. And so I love what you just said is like spirituality, sacredness, and the mundane, right? The idea like there's so many mundane parts of life that the idea of this is an old saying, but there's no atheist in a foxhole. This is not a religious statement, and that one is. But like the point of like, you know, an atheist in a foxhole being like the place that you hide in the middle of a battlefield, like, oh God, help me, save me from this horrible fight, right? Like if that's how you're operating as a leader, is like just when you're pressed up against the wall, when you're in the proverbial foxhole and you're trying to figure out what it means to be connected to the universe, that's probably sure, maybe that's a good first step. But if you're only operating out of reactivity to figuring out what spirituality in your sense of soul and your sense of self means in this world, you're probably going to find yourself a little bit thin in your ability to serve others with that. So I think what I heard from you, John, in my own words, is don't just be the atheist in the foxhole here. Be somebody who's thinking about this in a holistic way and look for those moments in the mundane parts of life to still stay connected to the greater sense of the universe, whether that word is God for you, whether it's universe, whether it's nature. Find the sacred in the mundane. That has been a tool for me to figure out staying connected.
yeah. So we talked a little bit about, look, we started with you have to have a process to think about self in these moments. I think we've connected that a little bit more to like beyond the moment itself of challenge. Like, how are you taking time to think about purpose, think about the good, and and to create opportunity for awe and wonder. So when the bad happens, you're combating that with the good that you know exists and you believe in. I think a lot of that ties to the second component of like, how do I get into a space of like, what's the right way to then come to people with this, right? We talked about that a little bit. Like, it's about helping people to lead themselves through stuff, right? And helping them to create that self differentiated approach as well, as best as they can. I think a couple things here I would know. We talked about this last time, but I like repeating this to make it super clear. One of the things you have to ask yourself of when you're about to come to people is thinking about the way I'm approaching them. And I think it's on a spectrum. I think on one side of that spectrum, I would call these ideas of building connectedness and purpose, which can be empathy and sympathy, right? We talked last time, empathy is what everyone talks about. I'm not convinced that in most moments we actually can be empathetic, because it's this idea of like, can I really actually sit in this person's shoes and know what they're going through? Like, truly know it. So I think sympathy sometimes is this idea of I'm doing my best to understand that, and I'm caring and showing purpose for you, and I'm showing support, right? On the other side of this comes ideas of, am I accommodating for people? Which I think is actually a distancing. Like, I'm just accommodating for these people. I'm going to say the right things. I'm going to play I'm going to use this language to accommodate for their feelings and to accommodate and make them happy because I know they'll get upset, or this is really tough for them. So I'm just going to accommodate that. And then even further to the other side is pity. Like, I feel sorry for you. This is so much of a burden for you. And you either like ignore them. Frankly, that happens a lot. Like, you do feel pity, but you stay away from them, or you do things for them so you don't have to like hear them complain or be sad or whatever it might be. You have to ask yourself, how am I actually showing up in an attempt to show sympathy and care and support, but still push, or am I actually getting closer to a place of accommodating and pity for folks? And I think creating some sort of scale for yourself on that spectrum that actually asks, how am I planning to come to people with this, and where does it fall on that, is key. And it's a bit of a gray area, and you have to judge for yourself. But I've fallen a lot into pity and accommodating a lot. And I wish there was times I would have said, like, can I be empathetic? Maybe not, but I can be supportive and sympathetic and keep myself in the fight with them, but not do things for them.
Yeah.
So that would be one idea of other. and supporting team that I would push people on as well. Do you
I
have
love
thoughts
that.
on that, Josh? Because the last thing I'd want to talk about is like, great, what's it mean to actually move this to action, and a few things for people to remember when you're actually like, okay, we have to now move as a team on this. We can't just sit anymore.
Yeah, one quick thought, and then
Yeah.
let's do that so we can wrap here. I think what I'm hearing when you're saying that is almost the question of, am I operating from a place of self, or
Yeah.
am I operating from a place of pseudo self? Self being the thing that you truly hold as your principle, pseudo self being that accommodating space.
Mhm.
Difficult. There's not always an easy answer. And sometimes it's not even wrong to sometimes think through both sides of that. But the more often that you're operating from self, the more true to your
Yeah.
self you will
Can
be
you
and effective you will be for others.
can you describe pseudo self in your own words? And I mean, we don't have
Yep.
too much time, but I like that. When I hear that, I hear like fake or partial.
Right.
So maybe because
Yeah.
what's filling
Briefly.
what's filling
Yeah.
the void then if it's either partial or kind of fake? Like what's filling the void of
Yeah,
full self?
I don't know that the word, I mean, fake is a good
Yeah.
connotation, but it's not quite that. It's really just, again, those reactive postures we take in response to pressure, right? So the idea of accommodation that you just brought up, accommodating somebody else's emotions is because you're sensing a tension in the room or a tension in the space in the system. That's when you start to operate from something that maybe isn't true to yourself. So maybe you say, well, my true self here would be confident to say, I understand that this is a difficult thing for you based on what you've told me, but I still believe we need to pursue what we've said we're going to pursue.
Yeah.
Instead of saying that, you say, hey, it's really tough. I understand that like being a person with neurodivergence is really difficult, and we're not going to actually do what we said we're going to do, right? Like that could be a moment in which you're operating from pseudo self. You're not actually standing by your principle. You're standing by a more reactive response to a really important consideration. And that's a difficult moment to kind of navigate as a leader. But when you find yourself in a position where, and that's just an example there, that might be when you're pulling into a pseudo self posture, something that's like, well, I'm going to kind of rescue here. Like that person's going through something difficult. I'm not going to even you know, push further. I'm just gonna say, "Yep, you got it. I'm gonna save the situation. I'm gonna move forward." And that's not yourself coming into play, that's your pseudo self.
Yeah. I think the last couple I want to share, and I want to be quick, but I feel like I'd be remiss if we didn't mention them. Um, is the idea of like, okay, now we're moving into action. Remind yourself of a couple things. One, maintaining routine and consistency for your team and being that calm person who allows that and builds clarity. Those were two of the C's that Josh. So it's three of those that I'm thinking about for Josh is this idea of calmness, clarity, and confidence.
Mm.
Like when you can still create that, I think sometimes leaders feel jolted in these moments of we need to make some radical changes, or we need to have all these extra meetings, or well, that project we're just going to put that behind so we can deal with this right now. Often that just creates more chaos, and there are moments that call for these disruptions and these moments of like we need to put some things on the back burner, but they're not all the time. And actually, what you need to be about is like, how am I actually bringing direction and purpose and calm and consistency to this moment so we can keep moving forward on the important work? So, one is just maintain routine, maintain consistency. And another one for me, and then I'll let you wrap on this before I get into homework, Josh. I think there's, back to the idea of awe and wonder, you aren't always going to be standing in front of a big mountain or watching a beautiful sunset or listening to some beautiful bird chirp over here, but you can always have like an object or something with you that keeps you grounded. So I think the idea of talisman or just something that is like your focal point that allows you to remind yourself of, okay, be confident in myself and sit in my purpose and let that drive you so you can move forward. Right. So
Yeah,
just whatever that is for you, I think that's an easy, small tactical thing to do there. So
yeah.
anything to wrap us on these strategies, Josh? I think they're like strategies that are somewhat concrete, but not perfectly concrete. I
Yeah,
think
no,
they're
this
there.
is, I mean, this is why, books and libraries have been designed
Yeah,
to talk about spirituality and self. I
yeah,
think if anything, the closing thought I would have is just, if you haven't asked yourself about what spirituality looks like in leadership, if you haven't asked yourself, what am I actually thinking about the concept of self? Am I operating from my self consistently, or am I operating under reactivity consistently? That you should open up that exploration internally. There's a lot of people out there who'd be happy to engage in those conversations. I think John and I, speaking for me, I would be more than happy to do that,
yeah,
and I'm sure John would be too.
yeah.
But
Well,
that's how I would wrap, and I'll pass it back to you to close us out.
Yeah, I want homework. I think one is walk through these 5 questions and kind of put them to memory as best you can and use them when needed. I'd actually say my push for you this week is I like this frame that Josh and I talked about of, again, you can't manufacture awe, but you can create the conditions where it can come. And so find time this week to sit in the good, to sit in some wonder of something, whether that's the present of another or some beautiful writing or just something that's making you think differently, and like connect on like why that's powerful for you.
Just be careful if you're driving. Don't
Don't
totally zone out into like how beautiful that the sunset is. Let's be careful there. But yeah, love that.
So let's just do that one this week. And we'd love to hear your stories of where you found some awe and some wonder and how that's creating the conditions for you to be better the next time something real challenging comes up. I just want to note this too. We don't do a lot of ads, but I do think Josh and I want to know that we are both available for coaching on any level, whether that's like, hey, I need real practical advice on this problem I'm having at work. I talked to a gentleman the other day about he needed to work on his sales pitch. So we talked about that, to all the way into like, hey, I've got these behaviors that I really just need to unpack for a while. So if you're out there and you're looking for that, Josh and I'd be happy to, either one of us, whoever you like more, I guess, or maybe together, would be happy to talk to you and understand the problems you're facing and even just do one session on that. Or if that's something you want to engage in longer, let us know. So you can reach us at our respective emails and websites, which can be found in the bio. So with that said, until next time, this has been Leadership Limbo, where we make space for the tension and tools for the journey. See you in the in-between.